Want to welcome everybody. My name is Dan Glickman, former House colleague of the folks who are here, and we have a couple more in the audience who I'm going to introduce. Also a senior fellow here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. As a Democrat who vanished from Congress in 1994, I was just looking, the word vanished and vanquished is almost identical, and I think both happened to me. But, and by the way, last night, in anticipation of this event, I had nightmares about the election of 1994, so you folks are going to revive all this stuff. But I'm delighted to have the folks here, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Bipartisan Policy Center's program. It's the 5th event in our Democracy Project's 2012 election series. So we previously had a panel highlighting the decline of moderate Republicans, and so we have the series today, The Vanishing Moderate Democrat. And in honor of our colleague from Texas, Martin Frost, who's here, also our colleague Charlie Stenholm is here, our colleague Baron Hill is here, former member, and I think, was Chris Carney here? There he is, right there. Okay, Chris, pleasure to see you. I'm reminded of the old Jim Hightower quote, the former Agriculture Commissioner of Texas, who said, the only thing in the middle of the road is a yellow stripe and a dead armadillo. So I think we're kind of making that statement truer and truer all the time. But I also want to thank Center Forward, our partner in this event, an organization working to bring a variety of stakeholders to the table to find common ground among different parties and successfully transforming those ideas into tangible outcomes. And the chairman of that, Bud Kramer, Congressman Kramer, is on the panel today, and we welcome him. We have another series in our election discussions on July 31, looking into campaign finance, the rise of super PACs, and the third quarter of campaign numbers that will have just been released, and we'll be sending an invitation out in the next few weeks. So in addition, any other members, former members that I haven't recognized today? If not, I want to turn things over to our moderator for today, the director of our Democracy Project here, John Fortier. Thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming. We're going to make this conversational. I have a few things that some of you have gotten perhaps in a handout. We don't have a PowerPoint. I don't know how many of you have them in front of you. We have a report coming out on redistricting, some of which really speaks to this topic of moderate Democrats and what sort of districts they represent. Let me say a few things about that, introduce the panelists, and then we'll have some discussion. If you look at the handout there, probably better to start at the back. The colorful charts show a Congress and what it looks like across the political spectrum. And if you have a look at the most Republican districts in a presidential election to the top and the most Democratic districts to the bottom, you can look back not too long ago, into the 80s and 1990s, and find that it's not all red on one side and all blue on the other side, that there are Democrats representing Republican districts and there are Republicans representing some Democratic districts. But as we go forward, and if we go forward to today, which is the last piece there, you look that chart has really changed a lot. And there are very few Democrats representing what would be Republican districts at the presidential level. And you also find almost no Republicans representing very Democratic districts. Unfortunately, the story of redistricting is it might actually get even a little worse. There are a few left, and some of them are endangered. You can look then at the beginning of the handout and using a measure that many political scientists use, the Poole-Rosenthal numbers of measuring Congress from left to right and their voting scores. You can look at the 50 most conservative House Democrats in the last Congress. And how many of them didn't either retired or lost in the last Congress? Those are the ones in red and blue. Number of them in green, not seeking re-election. We're using Charlie Cook's numbers, whether the seats are leaning a loss or leaning a toss-up or likely hold. Some of the purple ones are endangered, some of the toss-ups. And it looks like of the 50 seats, really only 3 or 4 seem safe. A couple more are in the toss-up category, and 40 plus are no longer in the Congress. So while we did see, I think, an earlier trend in the disappearance of moderate Republicans, certainly in the 2006, 2008 elections, and over time as well, we certainly have seen some very, very dramatic changes in the composition of the Democratic caucus in the last few years. Let me now introduce the panelists and then move to some questions. I'm going to start here with Senator Lincoln, who represented Arkansas in both the House and the Senate, served as the Agriculture Chair of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate. Then to Bud Kramer, who spent 18 years in the House representing a district in North Florida, in Alabama's 5th District for 18 years, and was on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Science Committee, and Appropriations Committee. And Representative Frost, who from 1979 to 2005 served as a member of Congress in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, representing North Texas, and was the ranking member on the Rules Committee, as well as the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for several cycles. These are actual moderate Democrats, no longer in Congress. We're really going to speak to the electoral prospects for moderate Democrats, their role in Congress, what the future holds for these. And we're going to have this question-oriented. I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists, and there's only one ground rule. If you don't like my question, you are not allowed to say, "What kind of clown question is that, bro?" That's not allowed here. We'll have some conversation amongst ourselves, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And so maybe I can begin with Representative Kramer, who and ask you about this question of how difficult it was, or what the formula was for representing a district that at the national level was voting for Republican presidential candidates, that many Democrats in your state and across the South had been voting for Republican presidents for 20, 30 years, but were electing conservative, moderate Democrats in their district. What was the formula? What were the challenges of doing that?
What I had to do in 1994 cycle really was a wake-up call for me. I'd sailed into winning my seat, considered a fairly safe Democratic seat, but I knew that my district was so connected to the federal government that I had to define how I did the job, not the party label, not coming up here in this arena and supporting the party or the party's agenda. Even before 94, I knew that was my challenge. And 94 made it brutally clear. I came within 1,800 votes of losing to a person who was so unknown in my district that I almost didn't take it seriously. But I did regroup, and I had to run from the national party. We started the Blue Dogs after the 94 cycle. Those of us that survived that brutal cycle came in together and said, we're not doing enough to identify ourselves and our agenda separate and apart from our party's agenda. And we were all about from the get-go working from the center. And that's what Center Forward, our forum is all about. So we would reach out. Now our leadership started putting its thumb on us and started, you don't want to do this. You don't want to be, I thought you wanted to go to the Appropriations Committee. You may not go to the Appropriations Committee. Well, sorry. True. I would sneak off and have a conversation with Martin and then come back and run that information back. But that was what I had to do. And I think I did it well, because the same guy that almost beat me in 94, his father was chairman from Texas of Ways and Means, and he's from a very wealthy family in my district.
Archer.
Yes, Bill Archer. I had to raise a lot of money and really identify myself, and the Blue Dog organization helped me tremendously.
Let me turn to Senator Lincoln. I had the pleasure of being in your state of Arkansas for a very interesting conference at the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute last couple months. Winthrop Rockefeller was, I guess, a liberal Republican, I guess you'd call him in many ways, elected, the first Republican elected ever as governor, and elected in the 1960s. But the panel featured a lot of Democrats who really paid homage to Rockefeller, because he had more or less knocked out the segregationist wing of Orville Faubus and brought forth a new era of what maybe people call new Democrats, or governing the New South of Dale Bumpers and David Pryor and yourself and Bill Clinton and the current governor. So what was the recipe for that new kind of Democrat that came starting in the late 60s, that really was the dominant party in Arkansas for 30, 40 years? What was the recipe that made you different than Republicans and different than liberal Democrats, and how did it work?
Well, I think that for Arkansans left to their own devices, we all get along. And, being open-minded, working with other people, I campaigned with Paul Rockefeller. We were good friends. He was the Republican lieutenant governor. I worked with Mike Huckabee when he was governor. But, as Democrats, I think being open-minded and certainly being accessible to people, working with them, whether they were business entities or other, really gave us the opportunity to strengthen ourselves within the state of Arkansas and as representatives here in Washington on their behalf. The concern and the problem that has grown, I think, exponentially since the time you talk about is the fact that there are so many outside forces now that play in our elections. In my last election, virtually none of the resources, or a minimal amount of the resources spent against me, didn't come from inside our state. They came from outside our state. And so, you know, I had one election where I was endorsed by both the chamber and the labor unions. You know, but working with people and working with everybody, both as a delegation and as well as you know, members in the Democratic Party in Arkansas, I feel like we were able to really accomplish a lot for our state, work together, and stay strong. So I think a lot of it has to do with the nationalization of the parties, as well as their role or lack of role at times in terms of the primaries. And I think that's a big issue right now that we're dealing with, are primaries.
Well, let me come back to primaries, because I want to think about some of the reforms that maybe can cut against some of this polarization of the parties. But let me pose one other question related to that conference. So later in the conference, we had one of your political analysts from the state, John Brummett, a columnist, who said, 50 years or so, this has been the dominant coalition in Arkansas, beginning with Dale Bumpers and really continuing even to today. But he wonders whether it's run its course, that the average Arkansan who might be able to identify with Democrats in Arkansas as different from the National Democrats is now trending much more to the Republican Party. Is it possible to maintain that distinction that is true in many states, that we're not the same as the National Democrats? We have this more moderate and distinctive identity here in Arkansas. Is it possible to maintain that, or is it just harder and harder with the nationalization of politics?
Well, with the nationalization and the explosion of media, I mean, Bud's right. You from states like ours and congressional districts, you couldn't take what the caucus or the Democratic Party nationally produced for you when you went home for a break. They'd give you those talking points, and we'd be like, yeah, right. I mean, you know, those aren't going to sell at home. That just wasn't going to work. And so I think it's going to be more and more difficult. The other thing, again, that for Arkansas, I mean, you know, if it flies or moves or squawks, we shoot it and we have a festival over it. And, you know, that's where you used to build your relationship with people, and you had the opportunity, whether it was the coon supper, or the chitlin dinner, or the whatever, you know, you went and you met and you saw 500 people, and you had an opportunity to really talk to them about why you were doing what you were doing and what they needed and how you were working to make that happen. Now, people gravitate to what they want to hear. And it's either through Twitter, or it's through emails, or it's through websites, or any of those kind of things. And you can't compete with that on a one-to-one basis. Arkansas has always been a state that was very much retail politics. And now all politics are wholesale.
And you could prove that you were like them at events like that. I'm one of you. I'm working up there.
Can I go back to the question you asked Bud? Because while my district was a little bit more Democratic than some of the other districts in the South, because I had a significant minority population, I still had a lot of really tough Republican parts of my district. And I remember the 1984 election, Reagan, Mondale. And I had a pollster, and I asked him to do a poll in my district and break it out by regions in my district, parts of my district. And in the most Republican part of my district, Mondale was in single digits. That means he was under 10%. And so I decided, well, I really need to go and tell my story in that part of my district. And so I intensified my personal presence down there. I intensified my direct mail. I talked about things that I had done for that part of my district. This was a long time ago. That type of politics worked at that point. I wound up running in that part of my district 20 points ahead of the national ticket. Mondale wound up with 17% in that part of the district. I got 37%, which was pretty good in that portion of my district, and I won the rest of my district by a nice margin. But it's very hard now to talk about those kind of issues and convince people that you should be in office because of the things that you have done or that you would do for the district. It's more national philosophy now, and that's what's different. Also, when I had 2 rural counties in my district at one point, and Charlie Stenholm was very helpful to taking me down and introducing me to the farmers, and Dan Glickman was Secretary of Agriculture and came down and did events for me in the rural parts of my district, and that kind of politics meant a lot. Now those 2 rural counties, which are just south of Dallas, have gone Republican, and pretty dramatically. And I'm not sure today, even with Charlie Stenholm's help and with Dan Glickman's help, as if he were still Secretary of Agriculture, that I could do as well in those rural areas that I did at one time.
To follow up, who have your own knowledge of your own district and your electoral prospects, but you were also in charge of finding Democrats across the country. And I so want to ask you about that challenge. How easy is it to recruit moderate Democrats around the country? And just in your time, there was some success. And I will say in 2006, in that wave, there was a mix of some liberal Democrats coming in, as well as a number of moderates, many of whom were washed out again in 2010. But what's it like recruiting candidates to run for office across the country and on the moderate Democratic line?
I became chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in January of 1995, just after we'd lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And so Bob Strauss, who had been Democratic National Chairman and a big figure from my state and from my city of Dallas, called me up and he said, "Martin, Democrats just lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And he said, "I know why you became chairman of the campaign committee." And I said, "Well, why is that, Mr. Strauss?" He said, "Well, expectations are low, and if you do okay, if you don't do okay, no one will care, but if you do well, you'll be a hero." Well, I didn't quite make hero status, but what I did was to break the mold for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Up until that time, we had not recruited pro-life, pro-gun candidates in the South and in the border states. And I said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to go down and we're going to find candidates who are appropriate for the districts. And I got some criticism from some folks on the left in the party because I recruited pro-life, pro-gun candidates. And some of those candidates won. I'm not sure that's enough now anymore. It's so hard to find people who are willing to stand up as Democrats and who have the credibility to run as Democrats in those parts of the country. But we did that, and that was one of the reasons we were successful. Now, we've lost a lot of those districts over the years because of redistricting, because of changes in partisan sentiment in those parts of the country. But we made a conscious effort to recruit moderates and conservatives during the 90s when I was chair of the committee.
Let me step back and ask a little bit about our last 2 Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and the current president, Barack Obama. Both were electorally successful, and I think people can sometimes overstate how different their coalitions are. But there's one great difference in terms of the part of the country that you represent, the Appalachian belt of states where Barack Obama is not very popular, where Bill Clinton had success in white working Democrats in that area. And there's a thought that maybe with the changes of demographics, there's a new coalition that Barack Obama has put together of more white liberals, African Americans, Hispanics, that doesn't rely as much on the white working class Democrat that Bill Clinton did.
White liberals in the South anymore.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. That's not in the South and in the border states. That's not a major part of the constituency.
But Barack Obama being able to win in Virginia and North Carolina with a different looking coalition than Bill Clinton was able to win in Arkansas and Tennessee and other parts of the South. Do you see a change in the party that is Bill Clinton's coalition ever coming back? Is it possible? Are there great differences between the two? Is the party really moved that has made winning in that part of the country difficult for a presidential candidate?
No, I was not necessarily. I'm not going to call your question stupid or
Clown question.
clown question. I'm sorry, clown question. But I was going to give a different set of information. You have what I observe, and I go back to Alabama still every week. Every Thursday, I'm back there. I'm on the ground. I'm listening. You get a mixed message on the ground back there. People don't even know what they want, but they're very turned off by what's going on up here. And the numbers of folks that are now self-identifying as independent voters are growing massively. And that's that silent center that is watching the extremes, the voices of the left and the voices of the right, the politics of confrontation, the politics of no compromise. They're watching that and they're going, do I want government to work this way? But at the same time, they're troubled by the deficit, they're troubled by the economy, they're troubled by what's not going on up here, and they just are turned off by everybody up here, more or less. But speaking now back on point to your question, after I almost lost in '94, it was as much because of guns, taxes, the Clinton health care agenda, the confusion over the conservative Democrats reacting to that and saying, I don't like that. What I had to listen to were folks coming up to me, and this was hard, after I almost lost, saying, I didn't vote for you, but I didn't want you to lose. Just want to strangle them. Really? I wanted to send your party a message. And boy, I won't vote against you next time. And I wasn't sure I could count on that, of course. That's a pretty wishy-washy sort of endorsement there. But I had to, again, back to what I first opened up with, I had to bond with my constituents all over again based on the job that I was doing.
I've got some thoughts, but let Blanche go ahead, because I didn't want to.
I think you're right, that, I mean, if 40%, roughly 40% of Americans identify themselves as independents, I think that's a growing group that, particularly in terms of economic issues and other things, education, just a whole host of other issues, that, that the president can make inroads there, particularly in the South, but they got to reach out. I mean, Arkansas was one of the few states that there was absolutely no presence of President Obama's campaign in the last go-around. So I think there has to be, some outreach there that makes sense. But Bud's right. I mean, people are trying to send a message, and it's really unfortunate because the extremes, they gin up the extreme because that's how they raise money. I mean, that's how they generate their resources. And it's unfortunate, but the people in the middle, all they have is that vote to say, I just want to teach you a lesson. I want you to know that I don't like what's going on in Washington. And then the extremes come through with the resources.
But I don't think it was a clown question, and I'm going to respond directly to the question because I think that Obama does have to try and recreate as much of the Clinton coalition as he can. And let me be very specific. I don't think he can win this election just by running the same kind of campaign that he ran last time. I don't think he can get enough votes just relying on black and Hispanic voters and urban liberals. I don't think that's a winning coalition, and young people, because I'm not sure young people are going to turn out in as quite a large numbers as they did, or as enthusiastically as last time. I think he has to somehow also speak to blue-collar whites, particularly in the Midwest. I think those votes are up for grabs, and I think he has something to say to those people. In terms of the auto bailout, in terms of preserving a domestic automobile industry and all the suppliers, as well as the GM and Chrysler, the major companies, I think those are very important issues in Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan. And he has to speak to that, and he can't be reluctant to go out and campaign for the votes of blue-collar whites, because I think that's part of where this election is going to be determined. And I don't think he can just rely on the same coalition that he had in 2008. Now, in terms of the Democratic Party generally, I am not sanguine about our chances of electing House members, moderate House members from the South in any great degree. We have some in North Carolina, I hope will survive. We have a couple of folks in Virginia here, and we have a couple other people. We have one in Georgia. I think what the Democratic Party has got to do in terms of appealing to the center is got to really listen to Democratic members who serve the Midwest and the border states and certain parts of the East Coast. In the more rural parts of Pennsylvania and the area outside of New York City and the state of New York, and has got to listen to what those people have to say, what their constituents are saying, and give them a real voice in the next Congress in terms of fashioning policy. I think there still are a lot of moderates in the Democratic Party. They just don't happen to be getting elected from the South right now in the House. We do have 6 Democratic senators from the South, 4 of whom are up for re-election in 2014. And I think that's going to be a major battleground, helping those 4 people get reelected. But on the House side, I think we have, as a party, we've got to elevate into positions of some degree of influence and certainly of listening to the voices of moderate members elected from other parts of the country. And there are some, and I hope there will be more.
I want to turn a little bit to some of the causes of this change. I mean, it's been a long-term realignment in a way of the parties, a long-term move towards very polarized parties. One thing that's come up is primaries, and we have someone here who's particularly familiar. We think of it more, I think, on the Republican side with challenges that are somewhat more prominent or more of them. What's the role of primaries? The primary system serve well the two-party system? Does it help elect a party that's more representative, or could we change it a bit to make it better?
I think there are a lot of people out there that want to see change in the primaries. I think they recognize the fact that it is the place where the extremes go now to be able to try to get the end result that they're looking for. And I visited with a well-to-do business person the other day who was talking about a group of businessmen that were just really, really concerned and wanted to know what can we do to change the primaries in a way that's going to give the moderates and the independents a greater opportunity. I mean, do we change the primaries? Do we eliminate the primaries and go to something like, the highest 2 vote getters end up in the general election? Or do we change the primaries altogether and give the independents a primary so that they have equal footing in the elections? But there's no doubt that the primaries are a place where the 2 extremes go to really try to affect the outcome, I think, now. And I think there will be more so.
Some thoughts on this, because I think the California system is crazy. I think that having an open primary, and even if you get over 50%, you still have to run again. That's nuts. If the Louisiana system, for all its faults, it was a variation of that, is if you got with an open system, and if you got more than 50%, you were elected. You didn't have to run a second time. So I think having an open system where you have 2 Democrats go head to head, and even if with some other candidates like you do in California, and even if one of the Democrats gets 50%, over 50%, and the other Democrat gets 40% or 35%, the top two have to run against each other again. I don't think makes any sense. I do think that having runoff primaries, as we do in the South, is actually very helpful, because you have to be your candidate's party, you have to represent a majority sentiment within your own party. And that over the years produced moderates being able to be nominated in the South. Now, if you have in the North, of course, in most of your states, whoever gets the most votes is a Democratic candidate, and you could get 15 or 17% of the vote in a Democratic primary in a big field and be the Democratic nominee. So if you're going to change primaries at all, I would have runoffs everywhere, and I would also have open primaries, as you do in the South. This has been criticized a lot, where independents can choose to vote in the primary if they want to. Yeah. What we do in Texas, you can choose on Election Day which primary you vote in. You walk in and you ask for either, as long as you're a registered voter, you can ask for a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot. So independents can vote in whichever primary that interests them at the time. When you have a runoff, you can't then vote in the other primary. If you voted in the Democratic primary the first time, you can't then go vote in the Republican primary in the runoff. We don't permit that. But I think there's nothing wrong with the primary system. I would not go to a convention system. What happened in Virginia a few years ago, my friend Tom Davis, who was a moderate Republican, wanted to run for the Senate, and the forces that be in the Republican Party wouldn't permit a primary that year. They had a convention because they didn't want Davis to be their candidate, so he didn't get to run. So I don't think going to a convention system makes any sense. There ought to be primaries, but they ought to be structured in a rational way.
John, right now, every sitting member of Congress is afraid of a primary. They're more afraid of a primary than they are.
Because of the way the districts are drawn.
No question.
Yeah.
No question. And the primaries are the place for confrontation, where your extreme left, your extreme right sort of confront their candidates, expose their candidates, monitor their candidates, and you would think that's not a bad thing. But for the independents watching that, they're so turned off by that. They're not encouraged to participate in the primary system. So you have primary results then that in the general election for moderates are a bad setup.
maybe we can move a little bit to the role of moderates in Congress and the role they play, and with the dwindling numbers on both sides and how that is affecting the workings of Congress. I guess I would say especially the Senate. You think of the various gangs that pop up, the gangs of 7 and 4 and 14 that sometimes are places where the parties can't agree, the leadership can't agree, but some sort of compromise or compromise plan is fashioned by a group of Democrats and Republicans coming together. Is that type of compromise that we've seen over the years, is that just dwindling? Is it going away? Is it what's the role for moderate Democrats, and are we losing that, and what do we lose if there aren't as many there?
Well, it's like Martin said, that you know, it's, I don't know, being that moderate, you just can't be as productive as you used to be, because the extremes push you in the extremes push in those directions for multiple reasons. And as I said, I mean, that's where they raise their money, by ginning up those two sides. But the committees are, or at least the ones, you know, I was on the chairman of the Ag Committee, had moved quite a ways up in the Finance Committee, both very bipartisan committees. The Energy Committee, we had a bipartisan energy bill that we actually got out of the Energy Committee. We just couldn't bring it up on the floor because the leaderships didn't agree with allowing us to do that. So, I mean, you know, I think there's great opportunity to try to do those things, and I think that's what the people out there, the electorate, want. They want to see product. They want to see progress. They want to see us doing something, and they know it takes time, and it's going to take some bold leadership. And I mean, you look at the presidential campaign right now. I mean, Mark Rubio, who's been one of the 30% of the Republicans that supported the DREAM Act. Now that the president's come out with something that's you know, at least a part of the way there to get to get something done in the interim, and now he's, I don't know, he's not supporting that. Well, it's because, you know, people don't want to cross over and, you know, support the other side when they're doing something that's right. I just think that's what's got people furious out there.
We've all, in our service in the House and in the Senate, we've had friends across the aisle that we've enjoyed working with, that because of committee assignments or issues that we had in common, we could get things done together. That dialogue is not going on as much now. Members are being watched more than ever by party bases back home, by their leadership here. That's why this Center Forward Forum is all about cross-party dialogue. We've held a number of programs where we have sitting Republicans, sitting Democrats, former Republicans coming together in discussions that should go on, that need to go on, so that the American people can see this place work in a much more common sense way. Members are more careful about that now.
But I never introduced a bill, I don't think, if it was rare, that I didn't have a Republican co-sponsor right off the bat. I mean, I made sure before I introduced it, because, I mean, that's the way you get it done, and ultimately that's what I think we were sent here to do, is to get results.
During the 90s, the first 5 years of the 90s, I chaired a special task force for the House on helping the parliaments of Eastern and Central Europe. And we took some trips over that part of the world. I never took a trip unless I had Republican members with me on the trip. We consulted, this was Bush 41 was president for the first 2 years when I ran this task force. We closely consulted with the Republican State Department. We didn't do anything that would be inconsistent with American foreign policy, and then Clinton took over and we consulted with the Democratic State Department. I don't know that those type things are possible anymore. I do have some thoughts, though, about what needs to happen next year. And I'm a Democrat. I want to see Obama reelected. I hope he is. I hope that if Obama is reelected, he will show a degree of leadership that he has not shown so far on budgetary issues. I think that you have to have presidential leadership, and I think it's important for Democrats to encourage the president very strongly to be courageous in his second term and try and solve the budget problems that face the country. Specifically, I was disappointed that he did not embrace the concepts of Simpson-Bowles. I hope that in the second term, if he is reelected, that he will move boldly in that area to do something about the deficit, and really bring Republicans in at an early stage and have them sit down and really talk about this. Because if you're going to break the logjam, the partisan logjam, you have to have leadership from the top. And if Governor Romney is elected, I hope that he would demonstrate the same kind of leadership. Somehow, whoever's president has got to rise above all of this that's been going on, the back and forth between the two parties, and really put some skin in the game here. And I hope that the president will do that, and I hope that if he's reelected and if Romney's elected, I hope he'll do that.
One more question we'll ask about the composition of Congress, and then we're going to look for some mics and open it up to the audience. We've been talking a lot about the dwindling number of Democrats from the South, which was the great base of moderate and conservative Democrats. But what other moderate Democrats are out there? Representative Frost referred to the National Party having to think a bit about Democrats in upstate New York and rural Pennsylvania and the Midwest as places to look. But I think of the New Democrats. The New Democrats are a group that overlaps some with the Blue Dogs and concerned about trade. I look at the Blue Dog membership and I see a number of Hispanic members who represent somewhat moderate districts and moderate voting records. Sometimes I think, monolithically think about liberal Democrats and conservative Southern Democrats. But what can you say about other types of moderate Democrats who are in the Congress and what their future holds that might be different than other regions, the southern region of the country?
I'll start if I don't mind, because there are some minority members, both black and Hispanic, who would, I believe, who would like to support centrist solutions. There are a lot of pressures on them from forces in their own communities, from their own districts, and nationally. But I do believe there are some of the minority members who could fall into this category with a little cultivation, with a little help. Secondly, there has to be some real leadership, not just on the presidential level, but perhaps out of the Senate rather than the House, because senators are a little freer to do things like this than House members. But I think you have to look to people like Senator Warner from Virginia to really step out. And it's a border state. It's not a deep South state. But you've got to look to people like that to say, all right, we've had a lot of deadlock here, in the last 4 years. Let's really explore some creative solutions, and let's bring some other people to the table, both Democrats and Republicans.
But we shouldn't talk about moderate Democrats as just being Southern Democrats. We just should not.
That was my point earlier.
Yeah, and when the Blue Dogs were at an incredible number of 55-plus members, there were probably almost as many that weren't from the South as there were from the South. And there were minority members, Hispanic members, African-American members as well, more women that were involved. Barron and Chris are proof perfect that it wasn't Southern members that were moderates. There is a different...
I represented the Alabama part.
That is true. That's right. So when we define a moderate district, especially in light of redistricting, we've got to look countrywide.
Well, and you've got the Ben Nelsons and the Tom Carpers, and I agree, Mark Warner, who can really provide some leadership. If Bob Kerrey were to take Nebraska, he obviously, having been a moderate when he was here, would be provide some of that leadership again. But they've got to have an opportunity to be able. Because they're not going to be there in the numbers that they need to be to really get to do the things, that I think would be very important to getting results.
The national media, of course, and I was a reporter very early in my career. It's been a long time since I've been a reporter. But the national media tends to all go in one direction, and right now they're writing off Bob Kerrey. They say, oh, he didn't have a chance in Nebraska. Bob Kerrey is a very creative, unusual politician. He has a chance of winning Nebraska, no matter what the national media says right now. And he was chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee the same time I was chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in the House. And keep an eye on that race. That race is not over.
Well, and people like Heidi Heitkamp, she's a very reasonable type person in that open seat.
North Dakota.
So there's just a lot of opportunity out there. I think it's just whether or not they'll have the ability to get their message out and the votes out.
And an interesting race will be Joe Donnelly's back on his home turf there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Because of Lugar losing in the primary, because of Lugar being defeated in the primary, and Donnelly is a current member of Congress, incredible person, that could be an interesting race.
All right, we're going to open it up to the audience. We have a mic, so if you could identify yourself, and we can start right here with Ramon, and we'll work our way across left and right of the room.
You talked a little bit about open and closed. Ramon Buehler with Madison Coalition. You talked a little bit about the primaries, open and closed primaries, about primaries versus conventions. You're probably aware that the Virginia Republican Party just decided to nominate its candidates next year in a convention rather than in a primary. And I wonder about your reaction to this idea. The single largest number of voters who are legally disenfranchised in America, including, by the way, black voters, are voters serving overseas in the United States military who are disenfranchised by the party rules of both the Democrat and the Republican parties in the presidential delegate selection process. Now, there is one human being that could end that with the stroke of a pen, actually two. One is President Obama, and the other is Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Because unlike in the Republican Party where there's nobody clearly in charge, they're clearly in charge of the Democratic Party. What's your thought about moderate Democrats going to Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Barack Obama and saying, end this legal disenfranchisement of military voters, but by the way, of any voter, and pass a rule that says that anybody who wants to cast a vote can cast a vote in the presidential delegate selection process, which means if you have a caucus, you have to allow absentee voting. It would enfranchise the military, be very popular. Party bases wouldn't like it, but it could give Obama a real edge with military voters if he took that stand. What's your thought as moderate Democrats about whether that would be a good strategy?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about your facts, and I don't want to challenge that right now because I don't have current information. At one time, my late wife, who was a major general in the Army, was in charge. She was adjutant general of the Army, and overseas voting fell under her jurisdiction. And the Army, I don't know about the other services, but the Army has actually tried to change its rules to make it easier for people, service people, to vote absentee. And in my state of Texas, I don't recall if it was something the state legislature did or if it was something that was done by Congress, but Texas had to back up the filing deadline and allow 60 days between the time people filed and when the votes were cast to actually let overseas military people vote absentee in our primaries. Now, this was the primaries for Congress. I just don't know what the situation is for the selection of presidential delegates. But clearly, we ought to do everything we can to make it possible for our troops to fully participate in our democratic process. Absolutely. And we are doing that, at least in the party primaries for Congress, as I understand currently. I just don't know about that. I don't know what the facts are on the presidential level.
In a caucus, you have to show up.
No, I know about caucus. I understand that. And I don't know what you do about that.
And there's significant practical issues there, and this convention, this party issue in Alabama, one disturbing trend that I've observed is on the local level where we used to have mainly Democrats that didn't think much about party labels. They thought about their jobs. That was a different generation. It doesn't exist now. On the local level, Republicans have been sweeping, and I mean, if you're a Republican and your name is on the ballot, you were getting elected, and some good people were being rejected in that process. The Republican Party is now scrutinizing those that are saying they're Republicans, and they're going back and looking at campaign contributions from times in the past, and they're not allowing their candidates to be on the ballot. And that's a litmus test.
Somebody gave to you.
Yes.
They couldn't run.
Well,
they couldn't
use that yet.
Yeah, well,
Go right here.
Hi, I'm Susie Kim from the Washington Post. It's interesting to note that moderates from both parties are losing more frequently to the conservative right. What do you make about the fact that moderate Democrats are losing their seats in red states, but to Republicans in the general, and not as often to liberal Democrats in primaries? And while they are losing their seats, the Democratic Party in Congress has begun embracing some more Republican-friendly policy positions, at least you've seen over the last term, in terms of embracing the payroll tax cut, Supercommittee Democrats saying they are willing to make some Medicare cuts, and you are seeing across both sides of this spectrum, at least some movement towards the right?
Well, there have been, in this election, there were several Pennsylvania Democrats who lost to more liberal candidates in the primary. So that hasn't gone on in a lot of states, but it has happened to some degree. Secondly, in terms of the general election, we have to nominate I would hope that my party nominates the most electable people possible. And there are some districts where no matter who we nominate, it's very uphill and very hard to beat a Republican, particularly in certain parts of the country. But I would hope that we have a fair nominating process so that we produce as close to a consensus candidate with broad appeal, and then we have a chance in the general election. But there are some very red districts that in this country where in most cases it doesn't make any difference who we nominate, whether that person is a moderate, conservative, or a liberal. We probably can't win those districts in a general election absent some sort of national landslide.
Okay, why don't we go over here on the far end here?
Mike Johnson, I'm with the OBC group, but I do some work with the Congressional Institute and its People's House Project. We had a meeting the other day, and we were talking about civility and consensus, and one of our board members said, you're never going to get politicians to work for consensus unless they have a political interest to do so. And we've talked about some of the problems here with national money, with the primaries, with redistricting, with the media particularly. So how do we get beyond one or all of these and make it in the political interest of politicians to reach consensus and speak in open tongue about compromise?
Two ways. One, and I don't recommend this, and I'm not hoping for it, one is a dramatic drop in the stock market, bad economic times. That gets people's attention. And I hope that doesn't occur, but that could be a forcing event. The other is if something happens in this election, and if a lot of incumbents in both parties are defeated, if the public just says, we don't like any of these people, and if a lot of Democratic incumbents and a lot of Republican incumbents lose, then that might get the attention of the folks who survive and who say, look, the public really is upset with us. We better work together, or it's in our own you're asking about our own personal interest, or we're not going to win the next election. Absent one of those two events, I'm not certain, but I go back to my earlier statement that somehow there's got to be very, very strong leadership from the top to bring people together.
These independent voters have got to express themselves, and they've got, and it's likely, Martin, it's in a cycle where they're so turned off by what's going on up here that they just say, if you're there and you're part of this, I'm voting you out. My friends on the Republican side say things are nasty at home, even in their fairly safe districts, that people are just sick and tired of the way the place is working. Well, if they're sick and tired of it, why is there such hyper-partisanship here? Why do members tell me on both sides of the aisle that it's more and more difficult for them to have working relationships cross-party aisles? I've even had friends that have said to me, we used to travel together. That's the way we got to know one another. Members don't know each other. They're strangers to one another more and more. And I thought it was pretty bad in the 90s. It's even worse now. But my friends across the aisle are saying, we're being watched. Our leadership does not want us having significant conversations, relationships, dialogue. We around town have got to say we want to be part of putting a stop to that as well.
No, and I think Martin hit the nail on the head. It's got to take a demonstration of leadership, and I think that's absolutely critical. I think the presidential election year offers us an opportunity to see that happen. I mean, I may be naive, the cockeyed optimist from Little Rock here, but maybe in the presidential election, this is an opportunity for both candidates to demonstrate some leadership and maybe step up and say, even before November, we have an opportunity to demonstrate leadership by finding 3 things that we can agree on, common ground. I would hate to see it be an economic situation like Martin mentions, but he's right. And come December, after the election, you're going to have a new debt ceiling vote, you're going to have sequestration, you're going to have tax cuts going away, you're going to have, all of these things that are going to start happening, and it's going to be a difficult time.
And if they don't happen, there are dire consequences for
Absolutely.
for the economy of this country.
Those of you who are not fans of musical comedy, the reference to a cockeyed optimist from Little Rock was the lead character in South Pacific.
Oh, now come on, Martin. They all
not
knew that.
everybody goes to see musical comedy. And she was played on Broadway by a Texan, Mary Martin, from Weatherford, Texas.
Where else would you get this kind of information?
Can I actually push back on a couple of points you made? The rise of independence it's clearly true that there are many more independents than there were, and that number is rising. The other side of that is that most studies show that a lot of those independents are pretty loyal to the Republican Party or pretty loyal to the Democratic Party. They have regular voting patterns. And when you look at people who are truly swinging one way or the other, it's a smaller fraction, 10, 15%. So while the number of independents might give people hope that there's a centrist movement all united, a lot of them are actually closet Democrats, closet Republicans in name. And I guess that on Representative Frost's point, the election that the voters rise up and throw out all the incumbents. And people have talked about that for a long time, but not many elections are like that. Most of the elections where people lose are waves one way or waves the other way. And so the general disgust where they throw everybody out doesn't tend to happen. I think that's partly because these independents really aren't so independent. They tend to really have some affiliation.
I don't know. I mean, you look at some of my very good friends in the Senate. Olympia just decided not to run again. And she was wonderful to work with. She and I did so many different things together. Dick Lugar, I mean, he ran and he stood his ground on what he believed. I mean, I worked with him on some tremendous issues. I stood my ground and ran for what I believed in. And I think that people can do that, but without a doubt, it's getting harder and harder from both the extremes that are out there that they raise their monies by the different, both sides do, they raise their money by accentuating the extremes, and then those extremes come into your state where you may represent a state like Arkansas. I mean, over 40% of our voters are independent. If you just ran on your Democratic base, you'd get a little less than 30%, and if you were a Republican and ran just on your Republican base, you'd get right at about 30%. So, I think it's just going to take some leadership for people to say it's okay to be in the middle because we actually want to get something done. And that's where most people in this country are.
But we've got to watch the flow of money in these races.
Yeah.
The money, the opportunity for the money to be spent against these candidates, the way it can be spent, who it comes from, what their motive is, the explosion of that issue, and the messages that can be bought by that issue are very punishing for a lot of moderates.
And though that's not the subject of this particular forum, I am for a constitutional amendment to change the law and to overrule Citizens United and those kind of cases. The Supreme Court, with both in the past, now it's been on a more partisan level recently, but in the past, both Democratic and Republican appointed justices have taken the position that money in politics is a free speech issue. And I think the only way you're going to change that is to amend the U.S. Constitution. It's a very hard, long process. I was one of about 5 members years ago who voted to amend the U.S. Constitution on this subject, and I hope that Congress will seriously look at that in the next session.
Dan Glickman.
Martin talked about a recommendation for the president to perhaps be more bold on issues like the deficit. Knowing the importance of presidential elections and the role of the president in terms of who gets elected to Congress, what's your recommendations to President Obama as he runs for re-election about what he needs to do in order to help perhaps not only move the country in the right way, but also move the politics in a way that might be more respectful of the Democratic Party as well as reaching consensus? I mean, if you were recommending Obama to do one or two things, what would they be during this election?
It's very hard to recommend what he does in the next 5 months because he's got his team. They know the kind of campaign they want to run. My view is that I want people to recommend, if he's reelected, that he be bold. I'm not suggesting he has to do it this, and this between now and November, but if he's reelected, I want him to come out of the chute in a bold way and say, okay, I'm not running again, I've got 4 years, let's solve the problem. But Dan, it's very hard to give them advice right now, tactical advice about what they ought to do between now and November.
But substantively, he's got 5 or 6 months, and a lot of patterns will be set, and they will effectively impact congressional races. So you were in this bag.
I think they're timidly sticking their toe in the water with it right now. I mean, you listen to what they're saying. Obama says he's more like McCain than he is Romney, and Romney says he's more like Bill Clinton than he is Obama. So they're trying just to tread around the edges of this issue of bipartisanship. Why don't they just jump in with all fours and say, okay, one of us is going to be president. Let's come up with a few things that we can agree on and show the American people that we are prepared to provide the leadership to move this country forward. I think that's a place where people could really coalesce around and say, gee, these two guys, maybe they're serious. Let's start listening to them as opposed to listening to the twits and the emails and the blogs and all the other kind of stuff. Let's see what they have to say about what they're going to do for this country, because we're going to hit a cliff here in a minute.
It's going to be just like 2004. Not necessarily with the exact same outcome, in which a president was narrowly reelected. I don't care what Bloomberg's poll shows today, with showing that Obama's ahead by 13 points. I don't believe that. I think this election is going to go right down to the wire. I think he may be reelected, but if he's reelected, it'll be very narrowly. And so that's why it's very hard for me to give advice to them about what they ought to do, considering this election is going to be so damn close. I just want them, if they get reelected, then to move.
And the administration has looked at Congress during their term so far and has decided that it's not, we can't partner. I mean, the agendas are just too different. The partisanship is just too strong. So they've more or less had to pull back. And so leadership from the administration, in a way, who could blame them, looking at what's going on the Hill, they've just been in their own world and run their. To be a moderate running in this atmosphere, this is a tough time.
I just say 1948 may be as much of a model as 2004, when Harry Truman made the decision to give him hell, Harry, and he went out and said it as he felt like saying it.
Right.
But again, Dan, remember that Harry Truman was the underdog in 1948. I mean, he was running from behind. Obama's not the underdog right now. So there is a little difference between now and 48. And the Republicans were, of course, you and I were very, very small in 1948. I don't recall much of what happened, but you had a pretty extreme Republican Party that had taken over, had been out of power for a long time. They took over. They ran roughshod over everybody for 2 years. And so I think Truman had there was a natural point to be made. And again, he was running from behind. Not exactly the same situation.
The economy improved a little more than robustly than it has now.
I don't know.
So-
Chris, did you want to
Well,
Yes.
First I wanted to comment, Blanche, you were actually talking about reasonableness, if that's actually a word. I've used it, but does it exist? I mean, I agree, sir, I can't remember your name over in the corner, but there's more of an incentive to politic than to govern.
That's right.
And when we see the current speaker come in just before he assumes his seat and say, compromise is a dirty word. We don't use that word, and we don't practice that way. We've got to do better than that. We have got to get to a point where that's actually in the vernacular again, in the political vernacular. The issue, of course, I think, when you get to the moderates in the center or the independents is, do they want that reasonableness? And the political scientists can probably divine that out using their statistical modeling and things like that. But do we sense that out there?
The two men that are running for the most powerful person in the free world, I think, have a great opportunity to talk about leadership and talk about the fact that compromise, as it was used when the Constitution was written, when this city, which is a compromise itself, Washington, D.C., it's not a state, it's a compromise. But when compromise was seen as leadership and a virtue, not weakness and a vice, which it is today, And this is the election that can make that happen. This is the election where they can step up to the plate and say, we may disagree on some things, but we're bound to agree on some things, and we're going to provide the leadership in this election, you know, to really show the American people that compromise is a way to solution.
And for those of you who have waded your way through Robert Caro's 4th book on LBJ, and I've managed to wade my way all the way through it, clearly the most interesting part of that book was how LBJ was able to get the Civil Rights Bill of '64 passed, and how he did it working with Everett McKinley Dirksen, the Republican leader. I mean, everybody who's running for office right now ought to be required to at least read that section of that book. The book is too damn long and too hard to get all the way through for most people, but it was, I don't believe that that's such ancient history that a president couldn't do something like that again.
Dr. Alan Abramowitz from Emory University cites as a potential reason why we're so polarized is because the electorate is actually polarized. I was wondering if you guys could comment on that, and if you think that's actually true or not, because I know you did cite a lot of the rise of independence and everything like that. But
Are the people as polarized as Washington? That's another way of putting it.
We're assisting them in that polarization, because now what they do is they go to a news source that tells them what they want to hear, as opposed to really hearing. I mean, they go to the websites or to the talk radio station or whatever that's going to really, you know, tell them what they want to hear or what they, you know, they've been hearing, as opposed to, I don't know. I mean, again, from those of us in the South that used to do a lot of retail politics, you know, showing up at a town hall meeting or at a coon supper or whatever, where you have an opportunity to actually ask the candidate what they think and get an answer. So I think, you know, we exacerbate the polarization because they tend to just go to find what they want to hear.
But Blanche, more and more those town meetings, as we used to know them, are places where the extreme left and the extreme right come to confront. They come to sort of hold you hostage, and they're motivated by the sources that they turn to.
2009, honey.
Brutal, huh?
They were brutal. But I started them out, and I said, you know, I grew up in a family where we were challenged to shoot for the moon, you know, be curious, be daring, get out there and do what you can. But there were 2 rules my mother had in our house. If it was rude or dangerous, you did not do it. And I told the crowds, I said, if you become rude or you become dangerous, we will stop this meeting. And we had differences of opinions, but people got it off their chest by and large in a lot of ways.
But a curious thing about those independent voters that you brought up, the growing number of self-identified independent voters. They may, in fact, be leaning more Republican or leaning more Democrat in a lot of cases. But it is worth mentioning that after the 2008 or coming into the 2008 cycle, which was when I left Congress, a lot of my folks back home that I consider to be fairly independent voters would say to me, I used to think I was a Republican, but I'm not a Republican anymore. I've voted against you before, but I won't do that again because I like the way you're doing the job. Now I'm hearing more and more from Democrats that are saying, well, I used to be a Democrat, but I'm not so sure I'm really a Democrat anymore. I'm not sure what I am anymore. And I think that's the middle that is vulnerable in a certain way, but is also mainly fairly silent.
I'll say in the political science world, there is some division on this. Alan Abramowitz, you mentioned, really is a proponent of the idea that the people are pretty polarized, and some of the facts we talked about before about many of the independents really having very regular voting patterns, even though they call themselves independents, is what he points to. On the other side, some point to the fact that if you really looked at everybody's policy positions, you wouldn't have 2 bell curves, that you'd have a lot more policy positions in the middle. But that goes with the fact that even though those people might have not down-the-line positions, they're still pretty loyal to one party or the other. So it's a mix.
Situation. I do some cable TV, and I think the others do also. I'm one of the people who appears on both Fox and MSNBC, and so I'm talking to both of these audiences. And it is interesting to me that CNN tries to stay in the middle, and CNN has the lowest ratings. That Fox and MSNBC are both ahead of CNN right now. And I'm afraid the country is awfully polarized, and I think people do go to their corners, and they do go to seek self-reinforcing information.
Let's take one last question, then we can take it over. We'll take two questions. We'll get one, and then we'll get Representative Stenholm after that.
Thank you. Andy Sullivan with Reuters Wire Service. Yeah, this is on. President Obama took office in 2009, and one of the first things Republicans did was said we're not going to work with you on the stimulus. And they opposed pretty much every single one of his major initiatives after that. Given that environment, the importance of doing compromise, it seemed like compromise almost was impossible from the start. Being in the middle, did that put you in an awkward spot? Did the administration try to push through too much? Should they just have focused on the economy rather than trying to do health care and cap and trade and this other very ambitious yet quite controversial legislation?
I think that's for blank, since neither one of us was in office at that time.
That's what I heard.
Well, I think we started out doing energy reform, cap and trade, what have you. Then we did kind of make an about face and jump into health care. Those of us on the Finance Committee had put in some long hours on tax reform. And so, people already have a hard time believing that we can walk and chew gum at the same time up here. So, having that many things going on at one time, I think was a challenge. But I also think that there were a lot of members and there were a lot of Republicans that I worked with on several of those issues. I mean, Olympia and I and several others worked on some health care issues. She and I had a bill a long time before we did health care reform here on, having exchanges, exchange pools, and basically giving the American people the same kind of health care that we had in our SEHBP bill. So the key for those things, I think, is whichever one you choose, you got to own it. And you can't give up once you pass. You got to still talk about it and stay focused on it. And I think that was some of the problem with what we were doing. I think people saw that cap and trade, as it was named, wasn't going anywhere. But we had a great bipartisan energy bill in the Energy Committee. We could have brought that to the floor, and we probably could have worked a really good bill. It wouldn't have been everything that the left wanted. But it would have been a good start. And I think that's probably the biggest problem, is everybody thinks you're going to take a pill and wake up the next day and everything's going to be solved. It's not a work of art, it's a work in progress, and that's what Congress was designed to be.
Whoever is elected president needs to, in January and February, invite the leaders of the opposition party down to the White House so often that they get tired of going. That's what ought to happen. And whoever it is, whether it's Romney or whether it's Obama, bring in the other side, have meetings with them, seek their opinion, try and work with them, and go the last mile. That would be my advice.
All right, last question, Representative Stenholm over here.
Since Martin was kind enough to give me credit for helping him in rural areas, I want to return the favor of saying, Martin, I appreciate you helping clean up my cultural characteristics in my district with your understanding of music and the finer points. One of the points, Bud, you've made over and over, and I certainly associate myself with all of your remarks about the difficulties of a centrist in Texas. But interesting situation possibly developing in the Senate, assuming it gets very close. And in Maine, you have two Democrats running and one Republican. Only one Democrat is running as an independent, and
He would not say he's a Democrat.
well, he is announcing he is an independent and will affiliate with the caucus. He will tell after he's elected. Okay, that makes for a very interesting potential spot for leadership, because if one vote determines the direction, which we've had in recent history, that makes a very powerful centrist leader. Now, Bud, you mentioned something that has gotten my attention quite a bit lately when we're talking about independent voters, and all of the things that we've heard are very true about independent. We don't know who they are, where they tend to affiliate. But if there were 15 independents running this year, you and I, among them, Blanche, Martin, running as independents in the same way that the fellow in Maine is running, And we had a platform of leadership saying we endorse Simpson Bowles and take a few other things that apparently are very popular with the people but not with Congress. And would the independents in our districts elect us under that premise? And then if we didn't deliver, we'd serve for 2 years and we'd be out. But what?
Charlie, I think it's damn hard to get elected as an independent in this country. You have to be in the right kind of state. Maine has a tradition. They have an independent governor right now, elected as an independent. Our friend Bernie Sanders managed to get elected as an independent from Vermont. Lieberman has declared himself to be an independent in Connecticut. That may work in New England. I'm not sure it works so well in other parts of the country.
Well, I would totally agree based on what we think we know, but if the people are as upset with the Congress as they say they are, unless we tried it, how would we ever know? And somebody's going to try it, and if it works, the No Labels group or these other folks may gain a little traction 2 years from now.
Well, on that note, we're going to close the panel and thank the panelists very much.